Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I would like to collectively acknowledge the land on which this virtual conference is originating from, the Robinson-Huron Treaty area of the Anishinaabe peoples. I'd like to thank Jeff Galvinsky for putting together the Mountain Connect conference, which this session is part of, and for inviting us to be part of his great lineup. My name is Amedeo Bernardi. I'm founder of Canada's Rural and Remote Broadband Conference. I also have a boutique consulting firm that, especially in recent times, has been focused on the challenges of rural broadband connectivity faced by both communities and service providers. I'm so glad that this group has graciously offered to be part of this discussion. We have a diverse range of backgrounds and perspectives that will provide a lot of color to the topic. The topic we are covering is Canada's intertwined regulatory and funding regimes for rural broadband, a critical look at the current federal regulatory regimes vis-à-vis public funding programs available and contemplated to address the rural digital divide in Canada. I'm going to do my best to moderate this half-hour session, but I am looking forward to our team's perspectives and where the conversation will flow. Next, I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves and provide a brief background before we dive in. Alyssa, if you'd like to go first.
Yeah, hi, I am Alyssa Moore. I am Senior Policy Advisor at the Canadian Internet Registration Authority. Our primary line of business is running the .ca top-level domain, but we also are a nonprofit, and part of our activities are to give back excess revenues to the internet community. And one of the things we do to that effect is we run this internet performance testing platform. And it's built on the MLab performance testing suite of tools. And it gives us a good picture of user-generated performance testing of folks' internet connections across the country. And we use that data to help communities, municipalities do advocacy and just get a better picture of what connectivity looks like in Canada.
Thanks, Alyssa. Amber?
Hi, folks. It's Amber Crawford. I'm a policy advisor with the Association of Municipalities of Ontario. Ontario, for those that need context, is the second largest province in Canada. And I'm pleased to provide my perspectives on behalf of municipal governments and communities more generally on how broadband has been affected on the ground. Just for context, there's 444 governments in Ontario, and 35 of them have over 100,000 in population, but 270 of them have a population less than 10,000 people. We have about 1.5 million rural residents out of Ontario's like 13.5 million. So that's just sort of some broader context, but my day-to-day, we are working with rural governments across Ontario, in particular about broadband, and part of that is to create a resource guide for elected officials that are trying to navigate this this complex water. So pleased to be here.
Thank you, Amber. Rob?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks, Amedeo. Rob McMahon here. I'm an associate professor at the University of Alberta. And I'm also privileged to work with First Nations internet service providers that are operating in rural remote regions across Canada through a group called the First Mile Connectivity Consortium. So looking forward to the discussion today.
Thanks, Rob. And last but not least, Greg.
Hi, I'm Greg O'Brien. I'm editor and publisher of Cartt, that's with 2Ts.ca. We provide news and information for people who work in cable, radio, television, and telecom in Canada. So I've been covering the TV, telecom, and broadband space and wireless space for quite some time.
Thanks, Greg. And thanks, everyone, and welcome again, and appreciate your time. So let's dive into it. Have I described the situation accurately as intertwined? Or do you think the relationship between the regulators and their funding mechanisms are more aptly described as messy? Or perhaps they're as good as they can be. I'm going to throw it up to Rob if you want to get the discussion going.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So yeah, intertwined, messy, I would say overall complex. I think that, you know, these types of relationships somewhat necessarily reflect the complexity of the topic and then also the stakeholders involved. So I did want to acknowledge, policymakers, they face a really challenging situation. Of course, with the urgency of COVID-19, all the more challenging. Citizens are calling for rapid solutions, but at the same time, policymakers must consider the diversity of the challenges as well as the solutions. And I think as well, the means that we use to achieve the end of universal service. So there's a lot of calls for universal service, but how are we going about doing that? So factors like geography, community size, the characteristics of communities and regions, all of this kind of stuff come into play. And network builders and policymakers recognize a one-size-fits-all solution is impossible, frankly, and flexible solutions are required. And then as well, I wanted to highlight the positions of stakeholders are complex. Very often, these parties are in competition with one another in environments that reflect limited funds, limited subscriber base, that kind of thing. So for example, commercial business models developed for urban centers, they don't necessarily directly map onto small population, geographically dispersed communities. So there are also alternative approaches that might be a better fit, such as nonprofits, for example. And finally, the regulatory mechanisms available to government are also complex. Policymakers have to consider the availability of shared resources that shape network development and sustainability in these regions. Right now we're seeing a lot of discussion around access to rights of way, spectrum, wholesale bandwidth pricing, that kind of stuff. At the same time, I think that all parties recognize the importance of deploying broadband to all people in Canada, regardless of where they live. So we also need a regulatory and funding environment that reflects the complexity of factors at play. And I think finally, to conclude, that COVID-19 provides opportunities to consider ways that connectivity is developed and delivered in rural and remote regions. And in doing so, allows us to explore innovative and cooperative solutions to this very long-standing and entrenched policy challenge.
So Rob, thanks for that. And does anybody else have a comment or want to weigh in on the topic itself?
Yeah, I'd like to. I think intertwined, but not always coordinated. It probably best describes what's happening here. Because we've got these various different federal programs for funding, some of which are coming from our federal government, some of which are coming from the regulator, and that's not exactly a funding program necessarily so much as a subsidy pool of levies to the industry itself. And then you've got some of the provinces doing various different things, and then you've also got the different parts of a network, and so some of the funding has been allocated for transport, like long backhaul type of operations or middle mile, something like the Alberta SuperNet, which was a huge undertaking when it was constructed. For the entire province of Alberta to go to every community that exists in Alberta for a point of presence, but then that doesn't get at the last mile. And so I think what we're mostly talking about in the context of this conversation is that last mile to folks' homes. And like I said, the different federal programs, different provincial programs, and then you have the occasional municipality or county who undertakes a project and gets quite interested in it. And yeah, it can be difficult to navigate for especially smaller internet service providers, the audience of this particular conference, to negotiate even with themselves, like where should I be applying our highest best use of time to go after some of this funding.
Now, Amedeo, if I could, just to add to the complexity on the other side of things, having communities basically try to navigate themselves, trying to figure out, what place in my community needs to be connected, what priorities make sense. There are, as we always talk about an urban-rural divide, but there's also intra urban and rural divides as well. Use these things like social housing and libraries. And so I think at the same time, the on-the-ground practical elements of this intertwinedness and messiness and what have you is really important to figure out at the policy level, just how to better connect ISPs with governments, with other stakeholders stakeholders to make sure that when funding does flow, it's done in the right way and according to the individual community's priorities.
Oh, thanks, Amber, and thanks everyone for that.
I can jump in too, Amedeo. I'll go the step further and say it's not intertwined. It's an utter mess all across the country for so many reasons. I've been covering this for a long time, and we've had stories recently where, for example, the Connected Coast project that was just sort of re-announced last week was originally announced 3 years ago. Nothing's happened. There was one in Manitoba announced 3 years ago. It was a local, provincial, band council, Indigenous services, federal project. The money was just revoked. Nothing was built. If you look at the various funds that are all around the country, they're all also double counted. So SWIFT, for example, the Southwestern Ontario Fund, says it has X number, hundreds of millions of dollars, but part of that money is from the federal government. You know, so, and then you start to get into some of these things, like the most recent announcement. The first actually SWIFT project that was announced was a kind of little company called ATEL, serving a very small village north of Guelph called Eris, and that's the first project that SWIFT has actually gotten connected in its 3 years of operations. And if you look at the number of politicians who showed up for the picture, we're talking local, regional, federal, provincial, and that's just to get a couple of hundred residents in Eris connected. And then if you back it all the way up to the Connect to Innovate level, we had a story in May that said only 25,000 households have been connected of the $500 million that has been handed out or guaranteed to be handed out by this project. So, and we've got no information, and we've asked from what's been connected since. So we've got, to me, it's an utter mess. That's the best I can say.
Well, you know what, I think a lot of head nodding on the utter mess. I think you were brutally honest about it, and so I appreciate that. And you know, all of you, everything you brought up, you know, we can go in so many directions. So I just want to pick up on a couple. And perhaps I was going to ask this one a little later, but because Greg just talked about the politicians and all these layers and everything, in my last panel we did for Mountain Connect, one of the speakers panelists talked about fiber to the press, right? It was all these announcements, and it's coming, and then nothing happens. And then when it does apparently get announced, as you've all mentioned, it seems to take forever to get anything going. So would it be generally true that one of the ways to improve it is to probably remove the layers of politics involved and get these communities served? And just a real brief reply if anybody's got a comment on that.
Yes.
That was brief. So
I'll go a little further to expand on it further, Amedeo. When I do these stories on the connected communities or whatever they are, the first thing I remove is all the politicians' quotes because they say nothing. I just stick with who is going to be connected, who might be connected, how much money is going to be there, and I take out all of the quotes that are literally the same quotes repeated in every press release all across the country by every level of politician. I take all of those out. So yes, please remove the politicians, and maybe it would get done faster.
And the industry thanks you for removing those.
I think, go ahead.
Sorry, just to you know, take that question a little bit further. I mean, once you strip out a bit of political posturing, there's still the difficulty of identifying the best use of funds to get the most people connected and to measure it and to report on it and all of these different things. And so, I mean, it does feel quite shocking that only 25,000 homes have been provably connected out of $500 million. But at the end of the day, we are dealing with disbursement of government funds here. Those are public dollars. And so there is a level of, you know, responsibility to have some of these layers of bureaucracy, but it certainly does feel like far too much.
I would say, as an association that represents politicians, I feel remiss not to say the counterpoint of to Alyssa's point, that the transparency and accountability of public dollars is really what this whole file seems to be about. And because we don't have a big sphere of influence over telecommunications policy writ large, I would say we have a very, very high need for economic development, keeping people in our communities, bringing people to our communities through tourism, permanent residents, et cetera. And so I think what happens, and what I see the other side of it, to say, you know, if I'm not quoted or I'm not at an announcement, I'm not seen by my residents and my companies as seeing it as important as it is. And so I get the posturing, and maybe the fact that there are delays on all levels, but I do think specifically because they're all the same taxpayer, there is a level of accountability for these funds.
I was also going to say, I mean, we always see these types of announcements. I'm thinking about, you know, low Earth orbital satellites that have been, you know, we've seen these announcements about those coming from various stakeholders for years now, but I don't know what's happening there. So we always see these types of, it's like the hype machine, right? Some parts are political, some parts are industry, you know, like various parties have their activities that they do there. So I just wanted to point that out, that I think this is kind of inherent to these types of projects. And I was also going to say, you know, I think what Amber mentioned about the different governments involved, you know, of course, these are involving, as Amedeo said as well, you know, you have the feds, you have the CRTC, you have municipal and local governments, you have provincial governments, and all of these are involved in the announcements, but also in some of the back end activities that happen as these things get rolled out, with the permitting processes, rights of way, etc. So while that point is very well taken with respect to the you know, the announcements that are made, it's also messy or complex, however you want to say it, at that other end as well, with the permitting and then regulatory structures, etc.
That's not to say there aren't successes out there. You know, but they tend to work better, at least in what we've been covering, when it comes to it's a company and a level of government maybe working together, without without worrying about who gets the credit or what the funding might be. Like I wrote about Gazfield North, a small provider in southwestern Ontario. They fibered up and got Wi-Fi all across a little community called Bell River, which is between Windsor and Chatham. And it was just Gazfield working with the Bell River Council, and got it done. No fanfare, no press releases, no funding agencies, no nothing. They just worked together and got the community connected.
I would just, as a further point of just the creativity is what it really gets to with Greg, is that I think the political will also must be there, the funding, yes, but the digital capacity of some of those communities really does need to be there as well. And I think it's important to celebrate the wins as well as the ones that seem sort of stuck, so to speak, or slower than we'd like and we'd hope. But yeah, there are successful models out there, and I think it's up to the councils as well as the ISPs to work together in tandem, and hopefully communicating around the other neighboring communities as well, to make sure that you leverage the economies of scale.
Oh, it's great. That's a great discussion around that, and thanks for expanding. Slightly different take. You know, we've also looked at, or a perception, I'll say a perception I have, is that programs are out to fund projects that provide the greatest number of connections for a allotted bucket of money. And I think we were talking about, Alyssa mentioned, you know, the last mile, and Amber talked about the communities and social economic development. But, you know, is it a matter of one throat to choke, one check to cut? Doesn't this kind of divert or distort where the funding is really required? You know, in those areas that have very minimal to no business case, you know, whether they lack the density, these tiny villages, or they're too far away off the backbone, and to which the government's aspirational directives seem aimed. Is that an accurate observation that I have? And if so, is there a better way or some tweaks we can look at, and taking some of the points you've already talked about? Does anybody want to comment on that?
Sure. I mean, that approach sort of, it gets the towns, the small rural towns and small rural villages connected just where the concentrations of people are. But it leaves behind, you know, the far north. It leaves behind, you know, farmhouses basically, where there's, you know, there's one house and then there's not another house for another, you know, 2 kilometers. It leaves behind certain people, and you know, I'll relate another story to you. There's a, you know, there's a broadcaster up north. They're trying to get their Inuktitut language distributed to all around Inuvik, but they can't do it because the internet there is so bad. So they have to go and try and get carriage on Shaw Direct satellite to distribute to the cable company that will distribute to these little areas all around, because they can't just put it on the internet like you would down here. So it's leading to the death of their language is the fear up there. So those are the type of things that would get left behind in that model.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm recalling that there is presently some funding that's directly meant for satellite dependent communities only. But like you said, like these are remote regions, and one satellite community is over here, and you've seen a map of Canada, the other one's way over there, and I'm getting lost in this weird background, but you get the point. And so there is sort of some set aside for the ultra remote.
Yeah, the first round of the CRTC fund was aimed at satellite communities. You're right.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to something that Rob mentioned, is the low Earth orbit satellites. I think that a lot of folks are just holding out for the promise of low Earth orbit from the various companies who have all announced constellations, and certainly many politicians or political staff that I've talked to is, oh, well, what about LEOs, and they're forthcoming. So yeah, there's some holdout for that as well.
I think those are a long way away though.
Yeah, as do I.
I mean, you know, Telesat and Kepler, the 2 Canadian companies, don't have very many satellites up there. OneWeb, which is the other company with Spectrum in Canada, went bankrupt earlier this year, and now they're back. And everyone's talking about Elon Musk today because Starlink got its BITS license from the CRTC. But the 5 of us could get a BITS license tomorrow if we wanted to. Starlink has no spectrum in Canada, so they can't even launch here, no matter how many satellites they launch. And I think they have 800 and some now, and they need over 4,000 to serve properly. So LEO is a ways away.
I think for me, it's the symptom of the greater problem, right? And I think this is why you see people sort of say, you know, well, don't worry, because we're going to put all our eggs in this basket, because this is going to be the promise that will come out sort of at some other time or in near future. And I think it just shows how much the need is to get residents and communities and businesses connected so that they can recover, not only in COVID, but keep people aging in place, everything from social, environmental, economic benefits that connectivity brings. I think that is more about, it's less about the technology that they're bringing and more about the connectivity that it can facilitate. But I take your point on managing expectations around LEOs in particular.
Yeah, it's funny. Leo it's my daily email from a client, from a customer, from a potential community. It doesn't matter where, and especially today with the BITS license. And I agree, you know, that's an easy. And I keep trying to reinforce. I know for Northern Ontario, FNOM, the Federation of Ontario Northern Ontario Municipalities, had put out not a press release, but basically a resolution that each community signed to say we support Starlink and similar. And so I know in advising my group of communities, I'm like, absolutely, as another tool in the toolkit. It is another weapon that we can use, and it's not today, certainly the analysts are talking about it, it's not the end all and be all solution. One analyst a week or two ago published, you know, some really good math on it. You know, even when Starlink is at full capacity, given the bandwidth it can carry, it can only cover 436,000 users across North America. So that's not going to answer really the rural, you know, broadband digital divide. but it's one of several things. There's white space that's on the verge and all these other things. And certainly, you know, we're trying to bulletproof communities with fiber, fiber to the home. But it is one of those topics that continues to pop up. I wanted to, you know, while we're into our last minutes, and it was something, Amber, that you had brought up in our discussions building up to this panel. And since we're talking about the regulators and we're talking about the funding mechanisms, pretty much all the regulators ask for some type of consultation with communities. And that's an important aspect of getting your, you know, your applicant, a carrier or a service provider, an ISP's application to the next step. What's your take on that aspect? Do you think that's strong enough just to say, hey, community consultation and check the box?
Checkbox exercises. No, in short, no. And I think this is why you'll see things like some regions or conglomerations of municipalities do better than others. And I think it is because not only are they communicating to ISPs and actually consulting in a meaningful way and not just in an email sort of ask for support, but it's also talking around amongst their own communities and their neighboring municipalities and the people within their own communities. Things like the MUSH sector that we talk about with universities and schools and hospitals. There are great municipalities that have put together those networks to interconnect them within that. But I think the idea of consulting for the sake of it, we're not a fan of, but I do think that the more consultation that you do in a way that will help on the ground is better off, and will provide a different product, a better product. But at the same time, you can also get consultations to death, really. So it is striking the right balance between it, and it's particularly complicated when you get into, as we do, we're completely agnostic to any company or association or technology that brings connectivity. But the more that you consult with those folks, you really do have to figure out where the rubber hits the road and just get started. So long-winded answer.
No, it's all good. You know,
Do you need, sorry, Amber, do each municipality or each region, do they need sort of a champion on council or within the staff, or a champion with some of the local ISPs or something to really push it forward?
Absolutely. I think as part of this resource guide I mentioned at the beginning, there's sort of 7 steps that we as staff have sort of put forward. And of course, it's mapping, it's making sure that you know where your assets are, what stands in your way. But it really is, step 5 is about championing investing strategically and you know, partnering where necessary. And I think the champion, I cannot understate it enough. It's about meeting with your members of parliament for funding. It's about meeting with your members of provincial parliament here to talk about actually making sure that the design of whatever program comes out is done well and then implemented effectively. But could not understate that more, Greg. It's important.
well, thanks everyone. I think we're pretty close to the end of our time. It actually, this flew by. And I think there were a few points in here that can spur its own topic for subsequent conferences. So be warned, all of you. If I can sum it up, I think starting off, we kind of talk about the intertwining as more everything from complicated to an utter mess, but the requirement for transparency because it is public money. So how do you work around those bookends? Another message I think that came out today is we need coordination between all levels of government and all the funders, whether it's multiple federal departments, multiple provincial departments. If we look even Ontario, Ministry of Infrastructure, Ministry of Education, and mining, and everybody seems to have these little buckets. And but if we get that coordinated, that'll go a long way. And then ultimately, well, not ultimately, but another portion of it that is an impact, whether it's large or small, is a reduction in the politicking. Just trying to align and get it out there and get the projects going as intended. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to thank all of you again for taking part. Really appreciate your taking the time in the lead up to this and today and doing it. For anybody that is watching, our bios are all up on Jeff on Mountain Connect's website. feel free to reach out to everybody. I'm sure we'd love to talk more about the topics. And again, thank you so much. And team, appreciate it. From the Canadian crew again, see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Amedeo.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.